You want to speak up for your patients. We're about to start. Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Sana Fadl. I'm the Interim Executive Director at Citizens for Juvenile Justice. I'm really excited to see all of you here today. This project has been several years in the making, so we're really excited that this is finally coming to fruition. I first want to thank the Boston Foundation for hosting us today. I also want to give a special thanks to the John Eldren Trust, which made this project possible. So 3 years ago, we started on a project trying to figure out why are so many kids in the child welfare system ending up in our juvenile justice system. We did a report almost 3 years ago that tried to answer that question. What is the difference between kids in the DCF system and kids who are both in the DCF and the DYS system? And what we found was that those kids had earlier child welfare involvement. A significant number of them were involved in child welfare system between ages of 0 and 5. We also found a significant number of them were bouncing from place to place. So the technical term would be placement instability, which you probably hear today multiple times during this event. So technically, if a child has more than 2 placements, that is a failure by federal standards. We are looking at the kids in the child who are duly involved, who had 3, 6. We had one child in our cohort who had 41 placements. Another piece, so when we talk about placement instability, just to clarify, it's 2 and under, like no more than 2 placements, you are stable. 3 or more, you're bouncing. So we'll be probably using those terms, going between bouncing and placement instability. The other thing we found was there was a significant rate of racial and ethnic disparities. So we looked at all of our cohort. The typical child in our cohort was a 14-year-old Latino boy from Harrington County. And also for girls, even though there were fewer in numbers, they were had a significantly higher rate of child welfare histories than the boys. And but there were a lot of questions we didn't know. We didn't know why. We didn't know, like, what are the things, the bigger question is, what could we have done to prevent their entry into the juvenile justice system? What can we have done before they became duly involved? And the 2 questions we were trying to answer are, what's happening around helping them around their mental health needs, and what about their educational needs and stability in their educational settings? So what we've done, when we say we, it's Kate. We've been looking at the data again, trying to get the mental health and education data with some limitations. We're also talking to experts. So we owe this project and the founders of this report to many of the folks who worked with us individually and in bringing us, helping us with the data, but also helping us understand the context and some of the recommendations of what's working, what's not, and where needs to happen. So for those of you, I see many of you having reports, but if those of you who don't, there's a full report in the back. We have all the acknowledgments because I don't have enough time to thank every single person who's helped us during this project. So with that, I wanted to welcome our opening speaker, Commissioner Willie Morales. I'm short and sweet. So Commissioner Morales is the commissioner of the Boston Centers for Children and Youth. And he has been a great friend to CfJJ. But one of the reasons we work with him quite often is that both in his personal and professional life, he basically personifies who are we trying to work, who are we representing, who are we advocating for. So I'm not going to go into, he's going to talk about his personal experience, but also some of the implications that he's saying from this work.
Now, I hope I do it justice. So one of the toughest things you can do is stand before an audience and give a speech. But I live with the trauma every day that I'm a New York Yankee fan that lives in Boston. So that's enough of what it is. But yeah, I've been doing youth work for now for about 23 years. And the funny thing is, the way I stumbled into youth work really came from the fact of the lived experiences that I encountered growing up. I was the firstborn to a very young family. I was the firstborn child to a teenage mother and young father. I was the last one in my house to be born in the same house that my grandmother was born and my mother was born on the island of Puerto Rico. And for the very first 3 years, my parents tried to make life there. And when my brother was born, there was a need to kind of sort of leave that Puerto Rican environment and move to the United States. Part of it was every mother's dream of trying to find a better life for her children and for herself. But the real reason that they were trying to leave the island of Puerto Rico was that my father eventually was a heroin addicted individual. He suffered that disease early on in his life, and they thought that the move to a new environment will be able to kind of escape those realities. Unfortunately, my father came also with the great optimism that when he comes to America, that the doors will be open and jobs will be opened and opportunities will be there. But unfortunately, what he found was frustration. He found frustration in the fact that language continued to be a barrier. Opportunities weren't as ample as he expected. And unfortunately, because of the fact that whenever he got frustrated, the way he dealt with it was to self-medicate himself once again. And so I can tell you about times of being a 6 and 7 year old, making a run down to the street corner at the corner of Acute and 3rd and making a purchase of heroin for my father. And that's the kind of experience that I got. By the time I was 8 and 9, actually 8 turning 9, I would witness actually the first murder that happened as my uncle Chucho, who's my father's cousin, will be murdered in front of me. And that traumatic experience alone, kind of baked in at that moment a reality that that the neighborhood I was growing up in, the way life was around me, I was understanding it to be very violent. That meant that anytime I felt that there was an issue or conflict, I addressed it really quickly with violence. So I became one of these behavioral kids who was really listed. I can't tell you what kind of system involvement there was in New York City, because we were living in Brooklyn, New York at this time in Williamsburg. But I can tell you that it was enough that when that incident happened, my mother closed down. And she thought that the way to fix it was finally pack up and move her children once again. But this time, leaving my father behind. I can tell you about countless times that I stood at the threshold of my parents' bedroom and saw my father physically beat my mother and see that kind of level of trauma happening again. That by the time that we moved to Boston, just the separation too, from the neighborhood that I knew to a neighborhood that I was coming to, was another traumatic kind of experience for myself. And it just kind of added more on layers upon more of issues that were happening. My mother, unfortunately, because she didn't have the financial literacy and she did not have the kind of marketable skills, found herself quickly working a lot of manual jobs. And for those in the Latino community, that meant that she cleaned a lot of office buildings and she worked a lot of banquets. And so a lot of times that me and my brother were dragged around to different things. And we used to enjoy helping her out cleaning office buildings, because we had races down hallways about who could pick up the trash the quickest. But at that time, because of the lack of not having those financial literacy skills, the only kind of housing stability that we had was actually renting rooms from other families that lived in developments. And so we moved around a lot. And this is where I got introduced into the foster care system. Unfortunately, my mother, because of the lack of language barriers or the lack of awareness or access to information and to be given clear guidance, she found her guidance amongst other mothers who lived in the neighborhood who were trying to petition and trying to secure Section 8 certificates. And somewhere along the line, somebody advised her, best thing you could do is actually put yourself in a shelter, put your children in foster care, and you will be elevated to a certain kind of standard. Now, I dealt with this sort of sublime trauma that never really manifested to a point of sort of explosion. But something happened when I saw that my family was being kind of broken up because of the lack of finances. Now, paint the pictures, 1982, right? Crack can present a very different reality, financial reality, especially for urban youth in Boston. But with crack comes more violence. And I remember that when my family was being broken up and I went to foster care, what began to happen was that I can't give you a bad experience that I had in a foster care. I think I had good families that were trying to do good things, but the reality is that they also weren't as educated and they weren't trained and they weren't able to understand the baggage that I was carrying. So it was hard for them to really make a connection with me. And so I became a habitual runner. Those of us who know know those terms, right? And I would become such an aggressive runner that all of a sudden they couldn't deal with me within the foster care system. So they said, let's figure out a way. And I don't know how I ended up, but I'm in DYS now. So I'm being punished for the simple fact that no one's able to sit down and say, what's going on in his young life? What is happening with this young person? And unfortunately, what had happened is that between the bouncing of the two, the court system will eventually get involved. Every time I returned back to an educational academic setting, I was always sent to what you should say the McKinley School, which was for the behaviorally challenged kids. And as long as I was housed somewhere and out of sort of the sight and minds of others, and people thought they were doing a good thing by me. But unfortunately, all of that continued to progress. By the time I was 17, and in between this point, you know, a lot of things have happened to me. I was a victim of violence as well as a perpetrator of violence. I was stabbed twice fatally, shot once between that door. And then by the time I was 17, I was deemed such a threat to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts because of the history of system involvement that I had, that I was actually sentenced to a 10-year mandatory sentence to an adult prison system. And one of the things that happens, and you're going to see a lot in this report talking about cultural competency, one of the things that was lost when my mother made the migration from New York to Boston was that I was a bilingual student in the New York public school system. Right? When they asked my mother, and she responded with the best English that she could, when they asked her how many years has he been going to school in Boston, she mentioned all his life. Right? They assumed that I was a regular student. So I continued to suffer academically. But actually, by the time I was 17 and entering prison, and I got there, I was basically fully illiterate. I mean, we had a third grade level comprehension, but not much there. And I remember entering that system as a sort of a badge of honor. You kind of graduate, right? You graduate. I graduated quickly through that system, and to get to prison with life meant a big deal, especially a kid who embraced sort of the street life and the street mentality. And I was really happy that I got there. 2.5 years into my prison, I used to hear that term arrested development, right? Here I was, a 20-year-old sitting in my prison cell, still thinking that I'm a teenager. I'm still 17 years of age. You know? That the reason, you know, to me, time stopped, but I didn't realize that in the free world, it was still moving on. And there I was, kind of stuck there. And I'm watching actually, all things, I was a big Seinfeld fan at that time. And so I'm watching an episode, and I can remember the distinct episode. The episode was actually the Soup Nazi episode of Seinfeld. And then I saw a news broadcast kind of float real quickly, a news bulletin about a young man opening fire on 2 Boston police officers with a 12-gauge Mossberg shotgun. And I remember jumping off my bed and glorifying the event as sort of the second coming of Jesus Christ. And I was speaking tongues. I was hollering down the prison corridor as I pressed my face through my bar cell doors. And I didn't think much about it. It's 10 o'clock. It's lights out. We go to bed. You know what I mean? I jumped on top of my top bunk, and I had a Kool-Aid smile. And in anticipation, I couldn't wake up the next morning to figure out who actually did the shooting, because the shooting happened at the neighborhood that I grew up in Boston, in the Roxbury section of Everson Square. And so I was happy that the whole thing had happened. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I had 2 prison guards wake me up roughly and ask me that I needed to take an emergency call in their office. And so I went down, and I'm not thinking that what I saw the night before had to do anything with me, until I could pick up the receiver and I could hear a house in pain, shouting, screaming, everything that you can conjure up. But I can particularly hear my mother's kind of screech. I don't know, it's like a duckling who recognizes a mother's quack. I can hear her screech and her screams and really hear her voice, because of the simple fact that I had been stabbed, so I knew what it was to hear her mother screaming that tone. And when she picked up the receiver, the phone, you know, and she was gasping, she took a deep breath and she screamed in Spanish, "Yo esperaba esto de ti. De ti yo esperaba esto." In translation, she expected this from me. And I'm saying it really lightly because my mother said it in a very angry tone. And I didn't understand what she was talking about as she hung up the phone. It was when 2 guards gently touched me on the elbow and told me that the young man that had opened fire on 2 Boston police officers lost his life was my only sibling brother, my baby brother. And something began to happen in the weeks that followed that I began to sort of assess my life. My brother was separated just as much as me. Unfortunately, his court involvement sometimes came through the fact that I used his name. So he went through his episodes of trauma the same way I did. But somewhere along the line, where people were trying to make plans for me, there weren't that much plans for him. And I think something happened with our separation and where I went to prison that really pushed him off the deep edge. And so I'm glad that this report's going to talk about a lot of the mental health issues, because I remember times myself that I began to struggle to say to myself, why am I thinking this way? Why do I think that it's right? Why do I think that because I get into a fight or into a confrontation with someone, I feel like I have to take that person's life in order to think that I won the fight, or vice versa? The only way they're going to win the fight is if they take mine. Something is wrong there mentally, and something's not being assessed. And, you know, I'm talking about a time where school teachers didn't understand what the mental health complexities were with some of our students. Sometimes it's better to ignore the situation and kind of walk away. So was my brother ignored? Because when a young man can open fire into a Boston police officer, and at that time, I forgot who it might have been, it was the YMCA president, who says you have a child opening fire into Boston police officers. That's something that you may see commonly sort of in Palestine, but not on the streets of Boston. Why are our children taking those kind of acts? You know, we wouldn't have to begin to think about it. So I began to analyze my life, and I realized that it all stemmed from every little episode of self-trauma that I kind of dealt with. My interpretation of life is based on all the experiences that I had, and what can I do differently to kind of begin to assess that. And it took a lot. It took me really kind of looking and assessing where the best resources were for me at that time when I was in that prison system. And I know that the report's going to spell out a little bit about sort of the competency cultural, but also it's about thinking about how so families can be a part of the plan in helping their children. I can tell you many times my mother felt frustrated every time they proposed a plan to her that she had no voice in it. And she basically, because of the lack of education and who she was in her life, she felt that she wasn't an expert to kind of raise her children. And it was particularly very frustrating for her all those years. You know, trusting someone else with her children, even though when she was seeing that the outcome wasn't the desired outcome. But she continued to trust the experts. And, you know, are we the experts? I recently heard that one of the biggest things that you have to do when you walk into a problem-solving situation is, first question you should ask yourself, are you part of the problem? And, you know, that's the stuff that I tend to hopefully type of work on. Eventually, luckily for me, like I said, I began to assess, humble myself, and began to get work. It took me a good 4.5 years before I got out of prison after my brother's situation. Once again, I come back to a community that doesn't want me. I come back to constant police harassment because they thought that I had an revenge agenda against the police officers. They killed my brother. And then lastly enough, you know, the BHA had told my mother that if I spent one night in her home, that eventually they were going to revoke her Section 8. So I found myself homeless in a homeless situation. You know, and so it was a really tough situation. But I was very fortunate enough is that the reason I took this job as the commissioner of Boston Centers for Youth and Families was that I was very fortunate that I had a street worker that walked up to me and kind of made the difference and started making the connections and quickly connected me to the right people that began to help me address on how I was going to deal with sort of my traumatic episodes, because even though I was out of prison, there was still a lot of trauma that I did not deal with. And I was very blessed and very fortunate that the way I've been able to subdue sort of the trauma that's happened in my life is the service. And for the very first time, I really began to answer it, to really design my own plan. And that plan is very simple. I figured the best way that I can plan to stay out of trouble is I can help people in trouble. I didn't expect that I was going to become a commissioner of 36 locations located in the city of Boston. But, you know, here I am today, and you know, and God bless and the work that we've done. But throughout that course of the time, I sat a little bit, a couple of years in the JJAC, I was in the Juvenile Justice Advisory Committee, and where I was actually lending a voice to the work that was happening there. If you guys remember back in the 2000s or so, we shifted our funding model to look at it being sort of a youth development model and making sure the kids were having sort of a circle. And Glenn Daly and I kind of advocated for that kind of stuff, because what we wanted to do was to make sure that people understood that you're not just working with the child, you're working with everything that surrounds that child in order to support them in their totality. And so we made some changes there. For me, meant that I had a lot of enemies because I was the chair of the funding committee. And so there was a lot of municipalities that I began to question, were they really diverting our kids from the court system? If we can divert them there and do something differently. And they was big proponents. By that point, which is no secret today, we all know that, especially from urban settings, families of color do not have advocates sometimes in the court system. And so that's why they get swallowed in by that system much quicker than anything else. And so we began to sort of question and kind of focus on that aspect of the work. In my role as Boston Centers of Youth and Families, one of the arms that I do have is the Boston Street Workers Program. I'm not sure if you're familiar with who they are and what they do, but they tend to work with about 600 of the most identified youth who could either be the victim or the perpetrator of violence in the city of Boston. And I don't have to tell you many countless stories of how many of those kids have multiple sort of state contacts. I mean, they've been touched by multiple state entities, and a lot of them are trying to maneuver through a lot of their surroundings. Some of them are returning back to settings of the same situations that I had, that the housing stability is not there. If you ever want to see why a spike sometimes of violence happens to individuals that are coming home, well, if you don't have a home to rest your head, you're going to become very restless. If you become restless, then you become very violent. And that's where the frustration tends to kick in. We're also maneuvering to try to figure out how do we support parents to understand how they can become better advocates of their children. So part of the street worker program is not only just working with that young person, it's trying to work with families about where do we get you to be in the right places. And one of the things that we're actually doing now with the street worker program is doing a complete sort of revamp of the program and looking at how do we also give them the skill sets to become more effective resource brokers so that they can help those young people that they're working for maneuver through their issues and through their concerns, but most importantly, to kind of really begin to assess, do they really have to go into the system? And all it is that how do we make sort of the community connections come back more. And in-house, within our own youth workers and within our own staff at our 36 facilities, one of the things I'm trying to pursue now is hopefully to look at trying to secure some funds to do, I mean, in all our camps, we have first aid as a training, right? There is mental first aid training too as well. We're trying to figure out how do we provide that to our staff to begin to really identify the signs and not do what was done to me, where people saw certain behavior patterns and they thought that by ignoring it or walking away from it, it's going to fix itself. It doesn't. It takes the intentional sort of process of making sure that we are actually strong advocates, identifying it and then connecting with the partners that we have. And until recently now, both Tommy Chang, who's the former superintendent, left while I was on vacation, which was surprising news to me. We were visiting DYS and trying to figure out a way how we can connect with those young people as they return back to the communities. What is the school and community kind of connection that we can make for those individuals as they return back to the community so they can have some level of support? But it was really surprising with great work, Kate, looking at the report, seeing especially the Latino connections. You and I have talked about it a lot. In the last couple of years, I've been working with the city of Holyoke, who's been experiencing some issues. Prior to the Maria hurricane in Puerto Rico, they had a large influx of individuals that were also leaving the economical hardship of Puerto Rico. And what was happening was that we saw their children exhibiting undesirable behavior because it was the way that the children thought if they act bad, they would be sent back, right? And they kind of were standing in their ground. And it was a very complex issue, especially for the school system at that time. And it was complex for the community because they just did not know how to address the matter. Part of it was that nobody was having a conversation. And it was having those conversations with the young people. The young people were actually dealing with the shock and the trauma of being separated from the island that they loved. They didn't see why they had to move. But then all of a sudden they come to the United States and everything's a little bit just harder. Everybody doesn't talk like them, everybody doesn't look like them. It's all a new experience for them. And then we began to sort of look at those aspects and pieces. But then you had parents that were torn because of the simple fact that they said, I can't afford to send them. If I send them back, every dollar that I make here will be gobbled over there. And so it was a really tough kind of piece. And today, Holyoke is experiencing a lot of harsh issues along with their high school, their school department, and their school system actually in receivership. But there has been some progressive talks in regards to working with them and developing their own we have a version of the Mayor's Youth Council, they want to do their kind of youth council over there too as well. So there's been some progressive talks about there. But it's, it's one of those things, as you go Western Mass, it's like you find less, you know what I mean? And it seems like the resources are here, but sometimes it's not equally distributed across. So it's going to be pretty interesting to see what kind of rolls out in the weeks to come. I know that, like I mentioned, I like this thing, this trauma to prison pipeline, because that was actually my story. It's been a series of trauma that got me to a place that I didn't want to be. But it's also the source of power that I use today to make sure that I do the work that I do today and what I do on a daily basis. So I commend all of you for being here this morning and participating and be a part of this. And I look further to listening and participating with you through the rest of the day, and hopefully to make some real, and not make relationships with you, but real relationships with you, and try to kind of figure out what is it that we can do together to begin to address this issue much closer. So thank you.
That certainly is the reason that we're all here. Thank you, Commissioner Will. I'm really glad to see you all. I promise you I'm not going to walk you through this entire report. Just going to do really quickly because it's a lot. Many of you I've already met with, and I thank you for being here because the conversations with you all did so much to inform this work and highlight things that we needed to look into more. But also the data was speaking to us. And the data, as everyone in this room knows, our obligation is to remember that data are people, they are kids. And so they can tell us something, but if we forget that we're talking about families, then we've lost the whole point. So, as Sana said, we started off with this information about the kids who ended up in DYS who had been involved or were involved with DCF. And you have a seat up here if you like. Our other panelists made it all the way through. So the methodology was to just start talking, to pick up on the interviews that we started with the dually involved youth, and to just start talking to as many people as we could to understand what else we needed to look at. So we spoke to therapists and doctors and social workers, and school-based clinicians were very helpful. Trauma specialists, DCF workers were telling us what they were seeing on the ground. DCF area offices were telling us what they were seeing on the ground. I would try to end my conversations with, what else should I know? What else are you seeing? What do we need to look at? Because the data, remember, is the DCF data is almost 6 months behind, right? So the quarter 2 2018 is from October through December 2017. That's the best we can do though, but 6 months is a long time. Who knows what else is gonna show up? We talked to researchers, we talked to mental health advocates, we talked to teachers and the teachers' unions. This is a big shift that's starting to happen within schools because part of all of our responsibility with this is to continue to move as opinions shift. And for the longest time, that idea was that teachers, like, we're not social workers. We don't want that stuff in their school. And that there's a massive shift happening with that nationwide and in Massachusetts. But teachers are now saying, this is part of how children learn. What's happening in their brains, what has happened to them at home, what is happening to them emotionally is 100% present in our schools and in my classroom. And until we address that, I can't teach, the kids can't learn. And the research shows that it only takes one kid in a classroom can disrupt that entire classroom. This is any parent in the room, any teacher in the room, anyone who works with kids understands that. But these are really important points. Teachers are now saying, no, this has to be part of the academics. This isn't an add-on. That's a trend that's happening nationwide. It's happening in Massachusetts. We have really, really good models that we can build off of, but that's the future. And we have a great model that we're gonna hold up in a few minutes. So, but just to reiterate, the interviews were consistent. The research was consistent. They echoed the same things over and over again. Get to these kids earlier, right? By the time they hit a certain age, the brain, the neurology, the brain patterns are so wired in, and it is so difficult, and they're so easily triggered. Is there any way? Law enforcement told us, please get to these kids earlier. Teachers said that. Parents, foster parents, that is what we were told. Please go upstream. So, meanwhile, we had to understand what was currently happening in Massachusetts, and we're just going to quickly look at that. So many of you probably know that in the past several years, there's been a huge increase in the number of care and protection cases in Massachusetts, particularly starting in 2016. Now, this data is not from DCF. This is data that was given to, was made public by Judge Collins, a juvenile court judge in Franklin, Hampshire County, who was so alarmed by the increase in care and protection cases in terms of applications for children to be removed, that he released it to the press and wanted it to be known. And the reason that we put it on a map when we could have just put numbers is because for us, it's very important to talk about communities and counties that are impacted, right? Because there is, as Commissioner Will says, we can really focus on Boston or certain counties. And meanwhile, we have an obligation to look statewide and at high impact areas. Judge Collins' opinion in terms of why this is happening, we don't know exactly why, meaning we don't have specific data. We are not given data. This child was removed because of opiates. This child was removed. We know that the vast majority of cases are neglect cases. It's over 100% because that reflects, it's added into it if it's a physical abuse as well. But so Massachusetts, it's the highest majority is neglect. Judge Collins' belief when he released this data was that it was 30 to 40% due to the opiate crisis. But there are other factors that, such as, Massachusetts currently being in a foster care parent panic due to some high-profile cases, some high-profile deaths. Additionally, DCF in 2016 did change some of its policies. But I quickly want to just help you understand some of these percents that we're looking at. There was a 70% increase in Plymouth and Suffolk, 73% in Essex, 65% in Worcester, 65% increase in Worcester, 63% in Bristol, 92% increase in the coastal region. But also it's important to look at a county like Middlesex, which had only a 27% increase. So part of the data is looking at both ends of the extremes, but since that's not extreme, but it's still important. What are they doing? What can we figure out that's going on there that didn't happen in some of the other counties? In 2016, DCF implemented major changes in its policies, including new intake and screening, new Carey, SORI, and National Criminal History database searches on all members of a household over 15. So we touch on this a little bit in the report, but again, we didn't want to go too deep into why this was happening, even though it's a very important piece of it, because we have to address that, but we also have to understand the kids who are already here. This is a huge increase in kids who have now been removed from their homes and are now in families who are now involved with DCF. And this doesn't reflect, which I will show, the kids who are in placement. So here are the kids in placement, meaning these are the kids who have been removed from their homes, are in foster care, congregate care, kinship care. So you can see we made it per capita, so so people could understand the impact on a community, right? And particularly, one of my interests was impact on schools. Because again, when a child is put into placement, they typically lose about 3 months of education time or fall behind. It is very difficult for children who are so socially oriented to be removed from the home. That is a trauma in and of itself. And then just if they start in a new school or to come to the same school the next day from a different home, or And also, there are other issues that come into play, such as separation from siblings, as Commissioner Will talked about. Children who, and so sometimes the school will be the most stable placement for a child. If we continue to implement and we push forward with the school of origin piece of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which mandates that we try our best to keep a child in the same school once they've been removed from the home, this is a very good policy because it is stability, and children need familiarity, familiar adults, familiar peers, people who know them while they're going through this trauma of removal. And it's also sometimes the best hope to keep them in touch with siblings who may also stay, and if they have to be separated. Those relationships are so important to children. That should probably go without saying. So you can see Franklin County has a huge per capita impact, but so does Bristol. We also, we are gonna dig deeper and already started to in certain counties to really talk about who the kids are exactly in placement in those counties. And, you know, for instance, we did a presentation in Bristol where we could also talk about exactly who the kids were in placement, what the language they spoke. So you know, that 50% of the Latino children in Bristol are living below the poverty line, right? 50%. But also that this is a Portuguese-speaking community. So that we have to also understand the language issues when we talk about cultural competence and language. It is worth it to go into the details. So this was startling in just that we happened to use the data to look at trends. And as you can see, the trends on the Latino community have been profound from 2015 to now. So the increase, so that from starting in 2016, there was a huge spike in all races in terms of children who were removed from the home. But the next year, in 2017, all other races went down except for the Latino community. Removals continued to go up. They didn't just stay the same, they continued to go up, and they continued to go up again. So there's something going on there that it's very important for us to pay attention to. This is a huge impact on this community and these families. This is also, so the Latino children accounted for 82% of the increase in children in out-of-home placement in Massachusetts. And this is also within the context of Massachusetts having the worst inequalities between white and Latino residents of any state in terms of income, housing, poverty, unemployment, incarceration, and educational attainment in the country. So in terms of youth in Massachusetts, the Latino youth in Massachusetts have the highest relative rate of probation, detention, and commitment to DYS. The age groups. This is very important because we have to understand that you're removing very young children at a higher rate. So, you know, how you present data is tricky because there's so many things that you want to show. We were mostly removing very young kids. The trend over time is that 6 to 11 age group. So this we find very important. These are school-age children. This is the trend. And again, what is so concerning, all of it's concerning, but what is so concerning, and then the next group is these 3 to 5-year-olds, right? So now we're talking about a bubble of very young children who have been removed from their homes and have experienced whatever maltreatment happened in the home that led to the removal, and then the removal, which is also a trauma for young children in terms of what is happening neurologically, developmentally, attachments, Children need, above all, as we know, to feel safe and connected. And each time when they are removed from their parent, their primary caretaker, that is a disruption and profound connection, no matter what is happening, that is deeply traumatic to a child. And we're talking about very young children. And if the research is now, the growing body of research now shows that very, very young children, pre-verbal children, have profound connections that we are disrupting, and it leads to behaviors later that increase in intensity if they go untreated. Continuous time and placement. So this is the other trend that we saw. The 2 to 4 years and the 4 years have been consistently going up. So that means the kids are spending longer time in placement. So, you know, there's certain things that we can't answer of which kids, you know, but we can see that those over time, 2 to 4 and 4+ years are the only ones that have been consistently going up every year. So again, we're talking about, from the previous slide, we're talking about very young kids, and we're talking about longer time in placement. We're also talking, with all this increase, again, gigantic impacts on families, on these children and families above all, but also on the court systems, the attorneys, the schools, the caseworkers, community-based health. Everyone is feeling the impact of this increase without sort of comparable tweaks in understanding of where we need to put more resources, who exactly we need to be there, what would help, because we don't have, we're not tracking the outcomes of our interventions as a way to understand what we should do more of, how we can adjust what we do. It's important to know that continuous time and placement does not mean the same placement. Right, so that continuous time language can feel misleading. But as Sana referred to, Massachusetts is considered to have a very high rate of placement instability, meaning that children bounce more in Massachusetts than the national standard, and then more than what other states have. And the more they bounce, the more likely they are to bounce more. And this is also, and it leads to behavior issues. The research shows that once they bounce or move, they're more likely to bounce, and they're more likely to have behavioral health issues, which then becomes a spiral that they then bounce again, right? Because we don't have, as Commissioner Will pointed to, foster families are just families, right? And they are also overwhelmed by children who have behavioral health issues. The amount of training that it takes to manage a child with any parent knows who has a kid that is difficult. That alone, it's a huge amount of work. We're overloading. We know that our foster homes are overstretched and overwhelmed. This we wanted to include so we understand that we can talk about kids who are in foster care and out-of-home placement, around 10,000. That number sort of manages to stay right around the 10,000 mark. But the kids who are at home or on the DCF caseload, there's something going on, right? And this is about kids who may be at risk of being removed, kids who may be experiencing trauma or have and need to get to be stabilized and help. But the numbers are, I find that it's important that we remember the kids who are still at home but who are on the DCF caseload and how young they are as well, but also this 12 to 17, these young kids, infant to 5, I wanted to touch briefly just one more time on the access to mental health issues, because the disparities. The number of Latino children in foster care, that this is a nationwide trend that started back in 2010. I think, I don't know exactly what's happening that correlates in Massachusetts, but it's doubling nationally. But in terms of that, it's also, the research shows that Latino children are 34% more likely to have a referral to child welfare, 15% more likely to be put in out-of-home placement than white children, and they're less likely to receive mental health services once they are in placement. And that brings us to the other thing that we have heard for years now in Massachusetts, which is the crisis level lack of child mental health clinicians, the long wait lists for child mental health clinicians, and for Spanish speaking or for non-English Spanish speaking, it can be as much as 6 months, which in the life of a child is an eternity. If a child is starting to show signs of distress and they are on a 6-month wait list, but this is also about families, right? These are about clinicians that can connect with parents who are non-English speaking, clinicians who are culturally competent that can help families prevent that removal. And when you're talking about cultural competence in language, you can help families access the required services to prevent a removal. Because above all, I think we all agree that the main goal is to keep children with their families, right? That is the number one way. Children need to be with their families as much as possible. We need to support families. We need to help families. And if we are creating barriers to access, and we already have barriers, we are requiring families to access services that there are so many hurdles for them to access, such as transportation, such as cultural competence and language. We're setting them up to fail. And then once the kids are in the system, they also don't get the services that they need. But children need to be able to stay with their families. We need to support families as best we can if we're really talking about prevention. But at this point, this report is talking about the nexus of these large moving issues that are coming together in Massachusetts right now. The increase in removals, the increase in care and protection, the gigantic impact on the Latino community, on certain counties that don't have the resources, on the mental health system that is not equipped and is over stretched and understaffed and under-resourced. And then we have this school issue, and we have this huge conversation that is so important and so good about trauma and behavioral health and social emotional learning and all these things that we now all agree are essential to any child. And where those children are is going to be in school. And the educational outcomes for children in foster care are nationally, we don't know in Massachusetts, we don't have the data, but nationally they are just terrible. The trend is, as of 2018, our dual status youth were usually 2 years behind in school by the time they got to DYS, right? But if we're talking about a child, it's unacceptable to have our children be failing, our children who are involved in the child welfare system, who we have removed from their homes, to be failing in school. So if they're going to be in the school, because we have this new money, these federal mandates to keep them in school, the teachers want the help, the kids need the help. It's where the children are, so it overcomes the barriers and it helps everyone in the school. This, to me, seems like one possible way to address many of these issues. It's not the total solution, but it's a concept where we have a nexus of money coming in. The Families First Act money coming in to keep people at home. We got to make sure that it reaches the communities that are being torn apart, that the Families First money gets into the counties and into the Latino communities and the communities of color that are being pulled apart. So that's our jumping off point. I want to bring up someone I'm so happy to have here who has educated me with her experience from being a mental health clinician in the field. Mirza Lugardo, working with families and children at South Harrington at Family Intensive Services, and she's going to educate us on her experience in the field. Thank you.
I have been battling a case of bronchitis, so I hope to God that I don't go on a coughing spell, because boy, do I want to talk to you guys. I hope to God I don't get too emotional. My name is Mirza Lugardo. I came to this country when I was about 12 years old because my mother was with my stepfather, who was an alcoholic and a very abusive man. And my step-grandmother decided one night to talk to my mother and tell her, you have to escape this situation, or I'm afraid my grandson, my adopted granddaughter, and you are going to be dead. Because for a few nights, my stepfather would have machete, and would be a machete, and would be going like this, filing the machete and telling me and my brother, I'm going to behead your mother with this. So get ready. And sometimes my stepfather would take my mother out of our bed. She would sleep with us. And I would try to fight him. And you see, I'm tiny now, imagine back then. As he was pulling my mother because he wanted to, now I know what he wanted to do with her. And so we escaped. But we were not told on that day that we were going to escape the island. We were told we were going to the mall. We were really poor. I didn't have plumbing in my house. So, you have a latrine, I don't know, outhouse. English is my second language, so I hope you can translate. And so we had to, take a shower back over there. And then by the time I would go home, my feet would be dirty. But hey, I had a shower. So, that's the poverty I came from, the humility and the humbleness that I brought. And so, but I was a nerd. I would escape everything by hiding in the books. My brother, another story. My brother would hide in drugs and alcohol. I would hide in the stories and the fantasies I would make by reading those books and knowing about Peru and Asia, and that was my life. So when I was told we were going to the mall, oh boy, I got dressed up and we were excited because we were going to the mall. The trip kept getting longer and longer. We went to the airport. I got excited. I've never been to the airport. Oh my God, look at this place. You get me on a plane. What mall are we going? We want to go to a very far away mall. Because we have to keep the secrecy. And my mother and my grandmother were scared that if we told others, my stepdad would find out. And literally, he would kill us all. So we got here. And I'm still thinking we're going to the mall. I'm going back. Because I love my little island. I love my school. I love my friends, my teachers. I was pre-puberty back then. I had some crushes on some boys. I was ready to go back with all the stuff that I probably bought at that mall. But then I realized a couple of days later when I heard over the phone, a phone call that I got from my uncle. And he was over there and I was here. And my uncle was my hero. He was my father image. But also an opiate addict who I buried in the town that I am right now due to AIDS and HIV. And then I realized, so when am I going to see you, Uncle? Oh, we're not going to see each other. That's when I realized. I didn't say goodbye to my friends, my family, my teachers, my little island. So that was a little bit traumatized, right? So I got very depressed when I came to this country because English was so hard for me to understand. And it was so hard, especially to serve as an interpreter in the welfare lines from my mother when I could hardly understand what it is that they were asking us. And I was the responsible because I was the oldest child. And my brother was not the nerd, so they had to count on me. So I tried, but I made a promise myself back there. And I said, no matter what, when I learn to speak in English, and excuse me for being, I'm a professional. But I'm going to talk to you real. So when I learned it, I promised myself, and I still to this day want to keep my promise. No matter if I'm in a line and I'm maybe number 1, and there's a number 70 over there who can't speak Spanish, English, I mean, I'm going to take number 70 and I'm going to follow with that person and I'm going to interpret what I need to. Because I thank God for many people who helped me. So there I was, being a nerd again, but they put me on a class with behavioral kids or something because I didn't know English. So I had to get back on track. And I became a very good interpreter because I had to take my history, my science book. At nighttime, I would translate so that I could understand what homework I needed to, get back, because grades were everything for me. And I didn't have that much, good grades until I got back on the roll. And of course, I went to school always feeling I'm less than all the baggage I had. And so I go to Cambridge College here, right? Because I ended up from North New Jersey, the crime state, Brick City. That's where I went. Little tiny Puerto Rican. I knew everybody's name, and I asked everybody, like, where the heck did they put me? So it was hard, and I became very depressed. I wanted to commit suicide. Once I wanted to throw myself out from the window that we lived. Thank God. I believe in God and angels and all that stuff, and my faith kind of kept me from doing that. But nobody knew the world that I was coming to. So I finally ended up here in Boston, and I went to Cambridge College to pursue a master's degree. And my amazing English teacher, God bless her, wherever she's at, on my 7th attempt of my thesis, a couple of days before school is over, 7 guys, she says to me, young lady, this is a good beginning. 7 times. What makes you think that you can have a master's degree? Why don't you go to a community college? I believed her. I said, what makes me think I can have a master's degree? Yep, I need to get this out of here. I dropped out of college for 2 years, but I don't know what happened. I said, I gotta go back. I sacrificed my kids at that point. I have student loans. I need to go back and let me see what I can do. But then, another teacher from the same school said, this is just a wall we want to climb together. By the time it was done, my thesis was top 3 on that school. And because I'm always working as a professional, but I'm very passionate, and I believe that we professionals, especially in the mental health field, need to have a wonderful foundation with all the theories, because we gotta know what we're doing. But then we cannot forget that unless we connect and unless we relate with all the theories and work with the people at their level, it ain't gonna go nowhere. So then I got, my second master's degree, and then I said, well, I don't think I should go to PhD because, what makes me think I can have a PhD? Let me just go for another CACS, certificate of advanced graduate study. So I have 2 master's degrees, certificate of advanced graduate study. Then you're starting to say, okay, I'm going to go for my PhD because a lot of people are telling me, why don't you go for a PhD? So I applied for a PhD, went to Antioch University, and I'm all but dissertation at this point. But I need to share this story with you because as a minority woman, you have to understand. And I hope the professors, although I have an angel with a lot of patience working with me, that for me to finally get a PhD, it's been a couple of years. I've shared that story with 2 of my colleagues that I convinced to come with me today. Meant that I'm going to separate myself even more from my family. Because this is what happens to me when I go to student barbecues, family gatherings. Oh, here comes a psychologist. She thinks she knows me. Don't be talking to her. Well, I can't, are you going to analyze me? These are my people. My brothers, my sisters, because my cousins are not my cousins. They're my brothers and my sisters. And my mother one time said to me, I need to tell you that you're doing something wrong. But since I don't talk the way you talk, maybe you cannot appreciate what I gotta say, but I'm gonna tell you anyway. That broke my heart. Oof! The woman who gave me life, who showed me everything I know, who sacrificed for me, now doesn't want to talk to me because her daughter is too much up here. I'm like, Mommy, yes, I'm going to argue with you, but you are my hero. So I needed to tell you this, because when we talk about mental health, when we talk about this, and we say, oh, there's no Latinos, there's no people of minority, where are they? Oh, we're here. We're here. But listen, when we apply for an application for interviews, right? You have a couple of people, and you might have Ivy Leagues, and you have me from Cambridge College. I love Cambridge College. And I remember that for some time, Harvard University had to sit with us in our classroom that talked about family therapy, because in Harvard University, they don't have a course of family therapy. They had to sit with us in the classroom. And that, it was so powerful for me, right? But yet, my degree is going to say Cambridge College in this number, but I'm like, yeah, but you were sitting in the same classroom taking this class. And I have to share that story because I am fed up with people saying there's not enough of us there. When we talk about disparities, we need to talk about education. And I'm going to actually quote Pablo Freire, which is one of my long time, for all time, people, you need to read that book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Pablo Freire, right? Because he says education is never neutral. It's a political process. Education is specifically designed and taught to serve a political agenda. And many of us have been taught and learned in such educational systems used by the oppressor. So we go and employ the same stuff we've been taught to the people that we're working with. As we all know, correct me if I'm wrong. Now remember, I went to like 3 graduate degrees right now in PhD, all about dissertation. Not one theory that I've come across is originally based on minority people, on Latino folks, on Indian, Native Americans, African, none. Unfortunately, all those theories are based on European ideologies and mentalities. And then we take those theories and want to employ it to somebody like, well, for me, sometimes it don't work. So I was, when I was teaching and supervising folks, I said, well, this is the foundation. What are you doing? What's the name? How do you know that you got to the place? And when do you know how to close? Yeah. In the meantime, how are you making that real for this family? So I have to talk about that because education is political. We always know how hard it is to get to where we need to go. And sometimes when we get there, we find a teacher like the one I found telling me what makes you think you should have a master's degree. But thanks to her, I worked really hard. But that's always that I'm never, have that little chip in there. And I never want to forget that. So when you are hiring people, professionals, look at those disparities and differences as well. And make room for people like me. Yes, I'm passionate. And I do take my job personal. But that notion, oh, don't take your job personal. Hello. My job is who I am. It is who I am, day in and day out. And I have 2 people to testify. And I got to ask you permission for one thing. I've been running this program for 14 years. I went to Southbridge, Massachusetts, the last exit before Connecticut. There's no blue line, purple line, green line, yellow line, silver line. No transportation. On the first day that this man takes me to the home visit, I said, pull over, I got to throw up. Because hills and trees, I'm like, Lord, when did the kids get depressed? I don't know how to play but to the trees. And I'm coming from Boston. We have richness here in resources. Over there, no. Our Southbridge public school system is going on almost the third year on receivership right now. Because we were graduating kids from high school that didn't know how to read or write. Hardly knew how to sign their name. Shame on us for creating systems that work like that. And when we are on mental health field, I had an experience one time at Boston University Medical Center. That's where I worked in the beginning, right? After working in Casa Mirna, in now Instituto Latino, Latin Health Institute, that was around here. And one of the things that happened is that I was just in my first kind of case with a kid. I'm going to give this kid a voice. Oh, great. Because that's, what individual mental health counseling teaches us. I'm going to teach this kid to have a voice. I was so proud of the work I did. Until I called to the emergency room downstairs, and I find this kid with a broken arm. I just fell through the stairs. Next week, I find this kid with a broken leg. I fell down the stairs. They want to say, no, there's something going on in here. And this is what this humble person learned as a clinician. I cannot give kids a voice if I do not teach that kid and those parents how to talk and how to use that voice in an appropriate manner. Because we are systems. The Latino population we are from the get-go, even if we are born here in the United States of America. I'm sure some of you wonder, the mother doesn't speak a word of English. The child doesn't speak a word of Spanish. Yet they communicate. Have you seen that? The mom, the grandma, they don't speak no English, and the kid don't speak no Spanish. But they live in the same house and they communicate. We are systems people. We cannot begin to treat our children alone. And when we do stuff in these numbers, Kate, going through those numbers and that report, I don't know about you, man, but it fires me. Because we continue to see in 2018 how our systems are continuing to make walls and have nothing to do with Mr. Right? We are doing a great job about continuing to do those walls. And some of us who are working passionately and day in and day out, sometimes when we get back to our office and our supervisors, what do they really want to know? Come on, be true. Are you meeting productivity? Are you all good with your notes? Absolutely. The insurance companies, that's what they're doing, right? So how do we? And I'm going to say this because this is the Boston Foundation. People here I know can make a difference. And we need to support each other. We need to learn how to work with the white and the black and the Chinese and the Puerto Rican, because one person alone is not going to be able to do it. But together, we can do it. So then we talk about that kid who didn't find a voice. His father was actually kicking him and beating him because he was being disrespectful. Because when it comes to cultural competence, I find some people that say, hablando inglés, pero no entendiendo something. I'm speaking English, but I don't understand nothing, not that freaking what you're saying. Forgive me for being so. But the thing is that you're speaking Spanish, but do you really know what they mean when they talk to you? Do you really know what the behavior of that child is saying? Are they just being a behavior modification issue? Children as well as teens, even us. Behavior speaks more than words. And I also get tired of some of us saying they're non-compliant. This child spends a whole hour here and he don't talk. Please forgive me. But maybe I'm never going to see you again, so I want to make sure I bring you the message. If you don't have a good supervisor that can support you, let's get one. Let's make group peer supervision. Because I know we can do that. We can create a lunch meeting. We're going to talk about those basics. Let's get together from different perspectives and different experiences, and let's see if by 1 minute we can understand that child and that family. My program, our program, and one of my team leaders, this is my last week at that program because, management and we're not non-profitable, there's not a lot of money, which is true because, our program has been successful 94 to 96% of 14 years of keeping the kids together in their community and with their parents. Good job. 94 to 96% every single year for 14 years. And it's because we know this is a system. Mental illness, just like substance abuse, is not an individual disease. It is a family systems issue. And when I say family systems, I mean also all the systems that we have to work with. Because we get a child that is involved with DYS, DMH, ABCD, LMNOP. Right? And so this one don't want to work with this one because if they're with DMH, they want to work with DYS, and DYS don't want to work with DCF because, blah, blah, blah. And so some of us have to become navigators, negotiators. But the reality is some of our jobs as mental health clinicians do not really allow us the time to go to those school meetings, to go to the court, to go, right? It's really hard. So how do we figure this out? I don't know. But I know one thing. I know that there's people in here that has the capacity and the will and the fire to make something happen. And when I met that woman here, Kate, and she started to say, Mirza, that chart there from this year to 12 years old, like something happens. And I keep telling our team, is like, this is the point of no return. If we allow this child to go beyond 12 years old without getting the things that they need, this is the point of no return. We're going to lose this child and this youngster to a DYS, to incarceration, to death, to an OD. So I encourage you all to look at those stats and make a point about not allowing those kids to go to that point of no return. Because once they hit there, only but the grace of God is going to be able to truly make a difference and a change for that child. Some of them get into an institution and something happens. And unfortunately, what happened, you lost a dear person. And you said, something's got to change. And we've seen that. How many of us have not lost people that we fall in love as our clients and as our family members? How many of us are having cases of grandmothers raising their grandchildren because their kids died because of an overdose or an lack? And until we realize this is a family system, we cannot just think about the kid. And then the other systems that are there to support us and to help us. Although sometimes are little walls that we have to learn to navigate are those other systems like DYS, DMH, probation, courts, the law, and people like the Boston Foundation, and people who have the funding to be able to look and support what we do. And so I'm going to close by saying another quote from Paulo Freire, because I think I'm doing my time. it says something about washing one's hand of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful. And some of us think that by staying quiet, let me not shake or pull, say what I mean in my emotional, passionate way. And I'm okay. But the thing is that what you have done is that you've collided with the oppressors and the power and forgotten about powerless. But my hope is that we are reflecting and we are going to be acting. And that is the only way we're going to transform the world. We have to reflect, look, see what's out there, and what's going to be our plan of action. So, I'm committing you all. May we see each other again. As we commit each other to transforming something that cannot continue to go on. Thank you so much.
Mirza, thank you so much. That was, again, exactly what we needed. I want to transition to our final panelist, and then we will have questions at the end if people have any. We'd love to have a conversation because many of you have a lot to add to this, I know. Part of what we looked into was, as you always have to do, is what does work, or what's working and what could we do more of, or where is a model that we can build off of. And you know, Worcester County has the highest number of children in foster care right now. And Worcester County does not get a whole lot of attention. And before I even knew that about the kids in foster care, I was already looking at the tremendous work going on within the Worcester, a model program going on in the Worcester schools that was working on the very issue of kids in schools and the high suspension rates and what can we do, what's a different model. And that I was already looking at Worcester HEARS. And then separately, I was connected by a fantastic trauma doctor out in Worcester to the wonderful Jen Davis Carey, who battled the Mass Pike traffic to be with us today. I'm very grateful to her. Yeah, she has her own trauma for traffic. And, but I'm so grateful that she's here because I think all of these issues are so complicated and so overwhelming. And I've been in meetings with many of you where there is a certain point where people sort of go like, it's too much. It's too much. We can't even get to these children in utero. We don't have enough money. We don't have anything. And it's not true. We have to keep coming back to saying, what can we do? And I'm so grateful to Jen. I think she should, this is a tremendous model, and it shows how we can bring in public, private partnerships and do a tremendous amount of good where the kids are. So thank you. Yeah.
Right here. Yeah.
All right.
Good morning, everyone. Good
morning.
And thank you for being here. The traffic was not that bad. I didn't end up swearing at anybody. So, but let me just, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Worcester HEARS program. It is a work in progress. We have been at this since really 2013. And let me start by talking a little bit about how we got into this.
Maybe point it out the screen. No, I mean the computer.
There we go. Because I had it upside down.
It's not on the.
It worked.
Oh, it did?
Oh, okay. Okay.
And there's a screen here if you want to look at it.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about how we got into this. In 2012, one of the assistant superintendents came to me on the QT and said, I want you to look at these statistics. I looked at those statistics and my hair was on fire. And part of what we learned right at that meeting was, as Mirza said, and I will riff a little bit on Paulo Freire, it's not just the education that's political, it's the questions that you ask that are political. These were questions that he could not ask, but that I could. My organization is the Worcester Education Collaborative, and we were founded in 2010 as an organization to be an advocate, some might say a pest, on behalf of the children in the Worcester Public Schools. So our portfolio considers three things: a small program portfolio, advocacy, and the work to educate the public on issues related to education. What the numbers showed was a significant number of kids being suspended for a variety of reasons. Some for whom things that we would have done growing up that you would never be suspended for, that it would be, you know, a harsh conversation with the principal, standing in the corner, as I spent the first 5 days of my school life doing, or your parents would be asked to come to the school. And then there was also, and that was about half of the kids. The other half were kids whose behavior was really quite worrisome, either evidence of very early mental illness or evidence of something going on. And it was that something going on group that we started to look at and started to get into the area of trauma and what happens to kids. The Worcester Hears Project stands for Healthy Environments and Resilience in Schools. And the point of the Worcester Hears program is to really work on adult behavior, using a universal design approach to change the interactions of adults with children. And in recognition that because we live in the 21st century, almost everybody is going to be experience trauma or be exposed to adversity in some way, shape, or form. So we believe that if we address this, we will see fewer incidences of discipline in the schools. The children will be able to settle themselves and be ready to learn. And that is the goal of the goal of the project. Did that change? Yeah, it did. Okay. So the HEARS framework is based on work. One of the groups that we reached out to when we were developing this project was Mass Advocates for Children. And they have two books that have become our Bibles, the so-called teal book and the magenta book. One talks about, gives a background on trauma and how children experience it. The other is what specifically can be done in schools. So we worked with Mass Advocates for Children to develop this. When we first began, and let me go back to 2013, as we got into this work, we hosted a forum at Worcester Technical High School. We thought there would be maybe 50 people there. That auditorium was filled with about 300 people. We invited teachers, we invited the school adjustment counselors, and we only invited the Worcester people. The word spread. And we had folks from a lot of the central Massachusetts towns. And as we began having the conversations with this, I was getting a lot of pushback from people in the administration, people on the school committee. These are bad kids, they don't need to be in our schools, you know, they're gonna be disruptive, they're gonna be disruptive to everybody. You're creating a dangerous environment. You need to back off of this. Well, I grew up in Brooklyn, so one, I don't back off, and two, I look at my 6th grade picture, which I sometimes use in presentations, and our class was very diverse. This was the area of Brooklyn that borders on we call it, as the anthropologists refer to it as an interstitial zone. It borders on Bedford-Stuyvesant and the more Shishi neighborhood of Clinton Hill. So we had faculty children, we had kids from the neighborhood whose parents were city workers and so forth. And as I look at, our class was together from 2nd grade through 6th grade. And so we knew each other quite well. And I look at that picture and I think of the stories in that picture. There was one boy who was the son of a faculty member whose mother was diagnosed with breast cancer when we were in 4th grade. And in 1965, that was a death sentence. We had another boy in the class whose father was a musician and traveled a lot. It was a big family, 6 kids. The mother was not very organized, and he often did not have a meal, and so would make the rounds to the families in the neighborhood who would give him dinner or lunch or whatever. Another girl who was the perfect child. We all wanted to be her. She had the perfect dress, the perfect hair, always had the lunch at that time. You had your lunch, your sandwich was wrapped in wax paper. Hers was always folded perfectly and so forth. What we did not know, what we did know was that we were never allowed to go and play at her house. She could come and play at our house, but we were never allowed to go and play at her house because her father was horribly abusive. Her father was a monster and abused her and abused her mother. And when we were in 3rd grade, she moved out of the house and lived with her grandparents. All of this was not talked about. This just was not talked about at that time. And there were no words, there was no vocabulary for what was going on in the lives of kids and no understanding of what was happening. So when they said, this is something you need to back off on, this was visceral to me and was not going to happen. So we brought a presentation. We brought Joe Restuccia, who is the major presenter for Mass Advocates for Children, and he did the first presentation. It was as if a light bulb went off in that room because people now had a different understanding of what was going on with the kids, that these weren't just bad kids who were being a pest and trying to be disruptive, but for each of the things that Joel described, they knew a kid who fit that description and had a different understanding at that point. And so that's how this project was born and how this project evolved over time. The goals of the project are essentially, as you can see, create connections with behavioral health professionals. So we have and this project has been funded very generously by the Health Foundation of Central Massachusetts. We initially started with a planning year, and then then we are on year 3 now of implementation. And I'll talk about not only what we've done, but what we've learned and what we would do differently. It involves professional development of everybody at the school, not just the teachers, but the instructional aides, cafeteria workers, and so forth. A supportive leadership structure and infrastructure and culture. So the principals were brought in this because what we wanted to see was whole school transformation, not just a classroom by classroom, who's going to buy into this and who isn't sort of change. A cohort of teachers and school leadership from each of the 5 schools that are involved in the pilot. And there are 4 elementary schools and 1 middle school. have been trained by Lesley University and have certificates from the Lesley Institute for Trauma Sensitivity. We want to see, and this is where it gets political, changes in policies and procedures in the school district and beyond, and I'll talk about that as we go on. And then meaningful partnerships with family and community organizations. This has in many ways transformed Worcester. There is now an umbrella organization called Worcester Acts, which is working with preschool organizations, with some of the youth serving organizations and some of the health organizations to develop a citywide framework that addresses some of these issues. Okay. The behavioral health professionals. This is our HERE support team, and they work with each one of the schools. It's a team of 2 who essentially do a circuit ride among the 5 schools that are involved in the project. And they help work with the principal, with the families, and with the healthcare organizations to get additional services for some of the kids who are in the red zone. Now, one of the things that has been a challenge for us in most communities, or I shouldn't say in most communities, in many communities, or let me just be honest, in typical suburban communities, you see the response to intervention triangle, where you have a lot of kids in the green zone at the bottom, some kids in the yellow zone, and a few kids in the red zone. In Worcester, that triangle is flipped. And so we have a lot of kids in the red zone, fewer kids as you move down the triangle. And so this has been a challenge. There's a lot of putting out fires, a lot of dealing with emergency situations and so forth. The other thing is universal academic and non-academic strategies. One of the things that we wanted to be clear is that this is not a program that is going to address the needs of just a couple of kids. This is going to require whole school, full school, every classroom on board intervention and change. And so we drew on a term from the disability community, universal design. And if you think about the time before, there were curb cuts in the sidewalks. And those were put in initially to address people in wheelchairs, but people with grocery carts, mothers with strollers, kids on bicycles, all use them. And so it became something that was beneficial to everyone. And that is the point of the flexible framework. It's called flexible because it needs to respond to the specific culture, the specific demographics of a school and a classroom. The Lesley University coursework was our work on professional development. As I mentioned, a core group of teachers and leadership from each school participated in the 5 Lesley courses and culminating in a capstone research project. This was very helpful. One of the issues, though, was we had developed this as a train-the-trainer model. One of the things where we have fallen short is that it did not actually work out to be a train-the-trainer model. And part of that is the churn that we see among the teachers. And so not all of the teachers who started in the cohort ended up finishing because they were in different schools that were non-HERE schools. The other are some anomalies of the Worcester Public Schools contract, which has very limited amounts of time for teacher professional development. So actually delivering this to the rest of the teachers at the school became a challenge. Communities of practice. Worcester is fortunate to have Clark University as one of the 9 colleges that are in our city. And Clark has been an extraordinary partner in every aspect of education in the city. One of the things that Clark does is create among their teacher trainees communities of practice where the teachers get together and support each other, bring cases, things they're having issues with, that they're struggling with, and bring those together for conversation, shared learning, and shared solutions. That has been enormously beneficial, particularly with the kids who are more challenged behaviorally, because if one teacher is having an issue, then likely all of the teachers are having an issue. So it's been very helpful in identifying and coming up with solutions for specific kids. Building partnerships with families and community organizations. We've been most successful in building the partnerships with community organizations, less so with families, partly because of the stressors that we all know that are on families, and adding one more thing to their plate just is not going to happen. So we've struggled in terms of finding a particular model that's going to work for that. Several years ago, a group of parents and an initial group of parents and administrators from Worcester's Latino Education Institute were trained in a program out of California called PIQUE, Parents Involved in Quality Education. It's a program that was developed in Northern California with a specific focus on Latino parents. And it's delivered in 2 languages, English and Spanish, training parents not just on issues that their kids will have, but on how to take a leadership role in the school, how to support their child academically, socially, and a host of other ways. So that we're continuing with that, and that has been enormously successful, with the caveat that it's one of the things that we have struggled with is training the parents, but having the schools not ready to then receive parents who are asking questions and who are expecting answers. And so that is something that we continually have to do. Once again, asking a question is a political act. Well, whatever. So the other thing that we did was, you all are familiar with the TED Talks. TED Talks are a series of educational videos that you can download. My organization has a license for that, and we did something called TEDx Salons, which were focused conversations on aspects of childhood adversity. So we did one, and I'll give you an example of one of the more powerful ones that we did. As you all know, the toxic cousin to childhood adversity is shame. Mirza, you talked about the idea of respect. And one of the things that our kids clearly feel is that they are not respected. And the circumstances that they live in and people's reactions to those circumstances can often be shaming, which just compound the issue. So we did a TEDx salon on the issue of shame. It was enormously successful. We showed a video, we did a reading, we did Dick Gregory's essay, Shame, and had a discussion. Again, light bulbs went off because people could identify either particular practices or experiences that they had had in the area. I talked about Worcester Acts. Our community foundation has just created a community initiative, a children's initiative, where we are looking at some of the global issues from a community point of view that are affecting the lives of our kids. The other is the Mayor and City Manager's Youth Violence Prevention Initiative, which is looking at ways to mitigate some of the violence that happens in our kids, particularly among the boys. So. Each of the schools was asked to create a flexible framework action plan and embed that in the accountability plans that are required by the state. And so the schools are doing that. Sustainability and next steps. Health Foundation has linked us with an evaluator from Brandeis University, and so we will start a full evaluation of the plan. I mentioned that we need to do something with the train-the-trainer model. We just met with the schools yesterday and are going to redo the training for each of the teachers that is involved in our 5 schools this year. We will do 100 teachers this year, 100 teachers next year in a 5-session training on this. And the principals will monitor the implementation of the flexible frameworks in the classroom. The other is advocacy. We've written a number of op-eds on this, and I remember my first editorial board meeting with our newspaper. The Worcester Telegram and Gazette is fairly conservative. And so I got the stonewall look until I said, let's just look at today's paper. A fire, a fight, the obit page. Each one of those stories, every single word in this paper is associated with a child. And that child has to go to school, that child has to go home, that child has to be in the grocery store, in the library. That is a real person. And at that point, once again, there was a different attitude towards this. That, again, these just weren't bad kids who were being a pain in the ass. So, again, asking the question becomes a political statement. So, our concerns. This is not an isolated school issue, as you all know. This is an issue that involves DCF. It's an issue that involves DYS. The other thing that it involves is our shameful policy nationwide of mass incarceration. Worcester is a locus in the Commonwealth for incarceration. And we can target particular neighborhoods, the Piedmont neighborhood in Worcester, Grafton Hill neighborhood in Worcester. So you can imagine the disruption that this causes, not just to individual families, but to the community overall. One of the things that we need to do is to be able to share information more freely. It has been very difficult for us to get information from DCF, for example. One of the things that would be very helpful to us and that we believe would make a powerful argument is if, in specific to Worcester, if we could overlay the number of the kids who are either DCF placed or involved or DYS involved with the discipline data and be able to see what's going on. The other, and I didn't put this on the slide, is getting information from the schools. The schools have been very protective of the information. We know from an initial report that we did, and it was the last time we got information on this, is that we can look at particular schools, and I suspect that if we looked at particular classrooms, we would be able to see individuals, teachers who are high suspenders. And we need to be able to work with those teachers. And then the other is developing an early warning system. Those of us who work with kids know what those warnings are, but we don't know them in a way that has been scientifically demonstrated. We should be able, someone with better statistical skills than I, should be able to look at certain behaviors, look at certain circumstances, and be able to identify kids who need to be, as I call it, teacupped, need special handling, need to be handled with care. And we need to know that in advance so that we are not always reacting, not just putting out fires, but preventing them. So, okay. Thank you.
All right, we're going to do a quick question and answer. I think we will turn the chairs around so our panelists can sit up here and we just take some, no?
Yeah, sure.
So does anyone have it? Oh, yes, we do. Excellent. Go ahead. Can you say who you are, where you're from?
Sure. Hello, my name is Samantha Calero. I'm the Executive Director of the Youth Advocacy Foundation. Thank you all so much for your work, and especially Dr. Lugardo. I appreciate you naming that our education system and all other systems are inherently political. My question is, in your experience or any reflections or even in the scope of this project, do you have any thoughts on provider bias, both at the point of deciding to file a 51A and then later on when the case is screened in or out, based on people's different communities?
Is it for me? Open dissertation, I cannot officially be called doctorate. That's a tremendous question because that's something that we struggle with a lot in terms of sometimes even the systems that we work with are pushing us to call that victim. One of the things that I encourage and train some folks is to really sit with the family before that phone call gets. Because if we really look at the foundation of DCF, it's supposed to be to help families, support families, and bring network and resources to them. That's what they're supposed to do. So if we are able to sit with the family, not placing the child at further risk, because I don't know if any of you have come across that if you begin to even say that, that child is going to be sacrificed by the family. And we know something is going on. So at those times, yes, we have to look at the biases of many of the institutions and co-workers and leaders that we have. But always remember that the foundation of DCF is supposed to be to help and support families and to talk to the families so that this phone call happens with the families, that they're voluntarily requesting those services, asking those questions, and not to just leave them out there when things happen. Because if we think about the amount of cases that are being called in, screened in, or screened out, that's another story. Because we can also see in those numbers how many times we know cases are screened out when we feel, as clinicians, that case should have been screened in. And it depends upon where you live, who you are, what's happening there. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but if I'm not, keep asking, because I'm sure that many of us here could also give something to that. But the biases, yes, they are there.
I mean, the data does show that the communities of color in Massachusetts are overrepresented in the child welfare system, and then overrepresented again in the DYS system. I mean, it goes up and up. In terms of the filings, I think it's a great question. It's part of that. We don't exactly know what's going on. We know that nationally, Latino families are 13% more likely to be screened in, to have a supported investigation than white families across the country. But we just, in terms of data in Massachusetts, it's a great question. Does anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jonathan from CfJJ. Love talking to you.
Nice to see you.
Yeah. About this. And I'm here with Kelly, who's a social worker at People Justice Boston. But I guess my question is, you mentioned quickly some money from families for, what is it called? My question was, what is that money?
Right, so that's it's new federal legislation, the Families First Act. It's gonna bring money in to preserve families. That's where we're headed. So, you know, some of us worry about families that are already involved not getting the increase. To me, my heart sort of sinks because I think I worry about the kids a lot who are in placement because I think, but it's about service. So it's a good thing. And I think it's something we should all understand. This is an opportunity to really raise our voices, to look at who's being impacted so that the federal Families First money, which is about, there's several chapters of it. It's a gigantic federal. What's that?
Do we know how much, or is it proportional to the?
To Massachusetts, yes, it is. But so it will be about where we apply those resources. We're gonna definitely get it. And part of the concept of raising it is making sure that the communities that are being impacted with removals, that we really make sure that money gets to where there's the highest impact. But it's a great question. I can send you a bunch of information. Yes.
If I can.
Yeah, of course.
Really early. It's not a one-to-one match, I know, but there is something that the state legislature is doing right now around what's called the foundation budget that's being considered this week after months of going back and forth. We can't do it, we can't do it, and now it's really pushing. We're really concerned that the bill right now in the House is proposing leaves behind the recommendations around ELL students in low-income states. And it's not a one-to-one match, but I'm certain that if we had more money for those two categories, some of that money would be directed to services and actual staffing to support not just the language act, but also mental health services. So definitely call your representatives this week, today, literally in the next couple of days. The Senate passed the bill that includes ELL and low-income. The House has. I just wanted to plug that.
Absolutely, and I want to underscore that, which we did not include in the report, but we started to get graphs on where the school psychologists are, right? And we wanted to include that, but it was already too much. But a big piece of this was that, you know, if you are in Brookline, you have a full-time child psychologist who's fully trained, who's there all the time, who addresses all the needs. If you are in certain communities, you have a part-time guidance counselor for 600 kids who's there once a week, and it's so disproportionate. And our concept also is looking at the not just the foundation budget, but looking at the formula for it, right? Because it has a mental health aspect, but right now, all that looks like, it could be a guidance counselor, part-time social worker. And what we're talking about, which is really important, is incorporating this. And what school psychologists were saying is just like, this is devastating to us, because if you bring us in from outside, we can see one kid that is covered by insurance. We can't help the kid that's crying in the corner, or we can't help the disaster that's going on. So that model, this is all about us understanding. All of this is well intentioned, but in order to do better, we have to keep tweaking our models and incorporating models from all over the country. But I think the foundation budget, it's ELL and high need, but it's also about really tweaking the foundation budget in terms of mental and behavioral health as a full-time incorporated piece of all schools, no matter where they are.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? All right, I'm so happy to finally, I want to bring up Courtney Cello from that Children's Mental Health Campaign. Courtney was absolutely wonderful. She was one of the very first people I met with, and I sort of blurted out, they had done a tremendous report on access to mental health services for children in Massachusetts, and it was sort of one of those documents that I carried around with me everywhere. And she was very kind to say, meet with this, and it got this project going. So I'm so happy that you were coming to speak for me.
Right. That is a tough act to follow. Nope, just so I will preface my remarks by saying I have the double threat of being super allergic to whatever's happening outside today. So I apologize if I'm a little sniffly, congested, and also a little nervous. I really like to be behind the scenes, sitting at coalition tables, not necessarily in front of rooms. So I might do a little bit of reading off of my screen, but I'm very excited to be here today. As Kate said, I'm Courtney Cello. I'm the Children's Behavioral Health Project Manager at the Massachusetts Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And in my role at MSPCC, I manage the Children's Mental Health Campaign. So the campaign is a statewide advocacy network. We work to ensure that all children have access to timely, effective, and compassionate behavioral health care. And the campaign is led by an executive committee of 6 organizations, MSPCC being sort of the managerial home of the campaign. We're joined by Boston Children's Hospital, the Parent Professional Advocacy League, Healthcare for All, I say Health Law Advocates, and the Massachusetts Association for Mental Health. Very grateful to be here today. As I said, I want to thank Kate, Senna, and CfJJ. This report is an incredible blueprint for us to follow, to help to guide our work, and really an affirmation that the work that we've been doing over the last several years in coalition together is really meaningful and is on the right track. The campaign has long partnered with CfJJ, and we're grateful for their leadership in transforming the juvenile justice system in order to better meet the needs of children and young people, and to meet their mission of helping to create safer communities, keeping more young people on the right track. We work in coalition with CfJJ because the majority of court-involved youth experience some form of trauma before entering the legal system, and I think that is echoed loud and clear in this report. As many as 70% of young people who are involved in the justice system in this country have a diagnosable mental health disorder. I'm proud of the work that CfJJ has invited us to be a part of as a campaign, and the successful strides toward during this legislative session toward raising the age of juvenile court involvement, disrupting the school-to-prison pipeline, creating pre-arraignment diversion for young people, establishing parent-child privilege, and more. And as Senna is always quick to remind us, we're not done yet. Children with behavioral health conditions and those who are victims of abuse and neglect share a troubling set of expected life outcomes, including increased rates of suicide, serious chronic physical health conditions, substance use disorders, and early onset of sexual activity. Not surprisingly, these children also struggle to do well in school, both academically and socially. And as is highlighted in this report, again, these children are more likely to become involved in the justice system. And that burden is disproportionately borne by children of color. Alongside CfJJ and other partners, the campaign is working to address these issues on several fronts. So over the last session, we've been working to ensure access to timely and appropriate care by requiring private insurers to provide intermediate levels of care. And this is getting back around to this family system that Mirza talked about, right? That intermediate levels of care are needed. So these services that are currently only available to children covered through this Children's Behavioral Health Initiative on Mass Health, making sure that we're providing services that meet not just the child, but the entire family, bring them together and rewire those systems so that children and parents can communicate in a way that is healthy and effective. We're also working to improve the transparency and accuracy of provider directories so that when care is needed, it is not difficult to find and does not require hundreds of phone calls. And we're also working to ensure that children whose care is coordinated by multiple state agencies, again, with pointing every which way, right, when they're involved in the A, B, C, D, G alphabet soup, that, you know, kids aren't waiting for weeks or even months in this state to receive care because state agencies and other authorities can't decide who should pay for services that everyone agrees a child needs. We're also advocating to ensure that there's an array of programs and services for children with behavioral health needs that are adequately funded in the state budget. One that's highlighted in this report is Health Law Advocates Mental Health Advocacy Program for Kids, or MAP for Kids, as we call it. When families end up at a family resource center, MAP for Kids steps in and helps to ensure that kids with complex needs are able to access the coverage, care, services, and academic supports that they need and are entitled to. Just a couple quick stats from that. 89% of kids served through MAP experienced a barrier to mental health treatment. 63% had accessed crisis or emergency mental health care systems in the past year. And the effect of the program in these kids' lives is enormous. Just one outcome, MAP for Kids was able to drop the inpatient psych hospitalization rate for these kids, from 44% to 14%. The average number of days that kids were hospitalized prior to involvement with MAP for Kids was 26. That is almost a whole month in the life of a child that they aren't out there in the world, in school, with their family, learning, growing, developing, sitting in inpatient psych unit. I think just to shift gears a little bit, as this report points to, the most important thing that the campaign is working on right now is supporting healthy development among infants and young children. And I think that's really underscored here. The data that Kate pointed to around the number of very young children who are becoming involved in DCF. And we know the trajectory is for these kids if they don't have access to all of the best supports and services that we know how to provide. Toxic stress or exposure to multiple adverse childhood experiences, including physical and emotional abuse, neglect, household substance use, household mental illness, directly correlates to serious delays in development to an alarming range of health and behavioral health consequences that can persist throughout a child's lifetime. In Massachusetts, as many as 135,000 children from birth to age 5 face one or more risk factors each day that could lead to toxic stress, with as many as 20,000 facing 3 or more risk factors. Improving access to infant and early childhood mental health services is a tremendous challenge for us as a state, but is perhaps also the most promising opportunity that we have to positively change the mental health trajectory and the life outcomes of these children. Skip ahead so I don't put us too far over time. One of the things that we're doing in this space that is near and dear to my heart is addressing preschool suspension and expulsion. So we talk about disrupting the trauma to prison pipeline and the school to prison pipeline. This is the earliest, best opportunity we have to make sure we are getting kids onto a healthy track. Suspending and expelling young children is not an intervention. It is a revolving door. It's a continuation of negative cycles that are probably already being perpetuated within that child's life and within that child's family history. And it's also preventing children and families from connecting with meaningful and needed support. And it's exacerbating disparities, doing nothing to set these children up for a positive academic, social, or developmental trajectory. So just to mention one piece that you can actually take action on when we covered from today, the House recently passed H4665. It's pending before the Senate. And what this bill does, it requires the Department of Early Education and Care to develop performance standards to prohibit or significantly limit the use of suspension and expulsion in all licensed early education and care programs. It also establishes the Early Childhood Mental Health Consultation Grant Program to provide consultation services and workforce development to meet the behavioral health needs of young children. Again, making sure that there's access to culturally and linguistically competent workforce to work with children. Time in the session is running short, but the work continues. Our next steps must envision a future where young people who struggle are recognized, heard, and continuously supported. We must prevent trauma when we can, and prevent children who have experienced trauma from entering a labyrinth of long waits, dead ends, and this revolving doors. This report envisions these next steps for all of us. It affirms that we all must respond to the breadth of critical points for disrupting that pipeline. As a society, we cannot afford to pay the price of ignorance and inaction when it comes to mental health of children. Compassion calls us to all of this work. Common sense requires us to assess the data and intervene long before a child's behavior becomes harmful for themselves and for others. And conviction drives us to keep this work moving forward. I don't think any of us would be here today if not for a shared desire to really roll up our sleeves and dive in to do this monumental work of trying to move the needle here. I think CfJJ's team exemplifies this compassion, common sense, and conviction. We appreciate this report. It is a call to action for all of us to strive for appropriate care for young children who experience trauma, as well as their families, to ensure that adolescents and emerging adults are supported in their development.
Okay, I want to thank this tremendous panel. I didn't mean for 3 out of the 4 of us to be from Brooklyn, New York, but turns out it's just happening. That's what's happening. Thank you all for coming. I do want to thank again the Alden Family Trust for supporting this work. It was a lot, and it was really worthwhile. There's so much more to do. There's so much more I want to do. I talked about a year ago. We talked about layering maps of people incarcerated and the school-based mental health and suspensions and expulsions. That's still my dream. I still want to do that because I think that's the only way you can take that to communities and go. And this is the map we're talking about. But we could do this and understand this with data. So, but thank you all for. Do you have a?
I just have a little point. I believe it's currently still in session. It was as of last week. But they're really looking at reentry funding, and they're thinking about going really lower than they have and cutting more homes. So I asked people to consider calling their senator about having $3 million go for reentry. And I believe the thing is with reentry is reentry helps families and helps youth and helps communities. So it's related. It's not the direct line for some of these things, but it is a really pretty direct line for helping young people. So reentry. Ask for $3 million from your senator. It's really important.
$3 million from your senator. Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Kate. I'm Sue.
Oh, hi. Nice to meet you.
That's something to say how incredibly impressive this study was and how much you accomplished with our grant. And we're going to stick with you, obviously. So
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all very much. You are free. Oh, sorry, Sana's gonna kill me. Please fill out your form. So she would not kill me. She would hug me and say, "Why did you do that?"
So what we have is these forms. If you want to
It's workplace trauma.
like this policy work. This is if you want to be involved in this work, you can fill this out, and there's a box in the back.
Please fill out your forms if you care about me.